Right. Hey, Seth, thanks for sitting down with me and answering some questions today. Glad to have you.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Well, let's go ahead and get into this first question that I have for you. I'd love to hear more about some of the environmental action that you've been leading in your community and how you first got involved and how your experience has actually grown over time.
Yeah, so my mom's actually had like a parks blog from when I was, I think, 2 years old. So I've been really connected with nature and all of that from a really young age. But my personal experience in like environmental activism probably started in fifth grade. I went to a Waldorf charter school, and we actually won the Green Ribbon Award. Um, and a lot of that was through my family working in the gardens on campus. So my first exposure to a lot of the environmental stuff was through actually more like the gardening, food side, and then moving more into the natural, especially like native gardening and a lot of that. And then at my high school 2 years ago, I actually started a gardening club and I originally asked administration there was a little abandoned area right by the theater, and where they'd cut down a tree a couple of years before and then never replanted anything. So I asked for permission to turn that into a little demonstration garden. And it turned out that a church that has been using our theater actually tapped that before me. But they asked if I could take over the 55 by 85 square foot native garden on campus instead, which was a super cool opportunity. So that's been where I've been working for the last 2 years. And then over that time period, a couple of other clubs have joined the gardening club, Eco Club, Science Club, and Green Team. And so we call it the E-Collective. And we've been pushing for a lot campus-wide sustainability efforts, including the native garden and other gardens for the culinary program. We've been working on a hydroponic system. The Green Team actually manages all of the paper recycling on campus, and there are a couple other projects that we've been talking about too. So
Nice.
yeah.
It sounds like you've been collaborating with a lot of the other people at your school, which is good to bring people into the movement.
Yeah, it's definitely all about community, and that's a big part of our fundraisers, because the school hasn't given us any funds for any of that, has been actually garden parties, what we call them. But we'll throw because like I play a couple of instruments and a lot of people in the club do, so we'll throw these garden party fundraisers where for like an entrance fee of $5 we'll provide music and like live music and karaoke and free food. And then we've been using that to fundraise. So it kind of builds a connection between everyone who's coming to the fundraiser and the space.
That's so fun. See, that's something that kind of surprises me, is like finding all of these cool, new, creative, and innovative ways to bring people together. So I'd love to hear more about some of the biggest lessons that you've learned doing environmental work, like things that have surprised you or inspired you.
I really think that community focus has been one of the biggest things I've learned. Like, it's just the need for other people it's not even necessarily surprising as much, but you don't realize how much you need other people until you're right in the middle of it. But also, as part of that, like, building community is so important, and because of that, it needs to be fun in some ways for people. Like, I know I feel a lot of times in the activist community, like, things feel really dire, and so you feel like you need to be fighting all the time. But as part of that, if you really want to like build a movement and include as many people as you can in the fight, you also need to make it fun and make it something that people look forward to.
Hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of this phrase, nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. It's like it's such a broad issue and you want to go out there and make all of these changes, but you really have to start in your local community and that just like you said starts with bringing people together for a conversation.
Exactly. And I always think of Carlos Saavedra has a quote too where he talks about how people tend to overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in 10.
Yeah, totally. Well, obviously, you're really passionate about this issue. Can you tell me more about why this issue is important to you, especially from your upbringing? Because it sounds like you've been around gardens your whole life.
Yeah. And it's, as I've grown to, I think I've realized how much environmental justice and gardening and a lot of that is at the intersection of so many of these other issues too,
Hmm.
right? Because if you're talking about gardening and environmental justice, you're going to talk about agriculture and food justice, and food justice is so connected with so many other things, water issues as well, with indigenous rights, and then public health issues are so tied to food justice, and it's all of those different systems, institutionalized racism, all of that are so deeply connected that it's you can really make a big change in a lot of different places by starting in the one small corner,
Hmm.
like food justice or gardening.
Yeah, that is so spot on. Like you said, all of these issues are interconnected, and it's really important to be knowledgeable about that because it might not be apparent on the surface. So you need those critical thinking skills to like see how one thing might affect another. And that really speaks to the power of education. So, what role do you think education plays in shaping young people to become leaders on not just environmental issues, but also social issues?
I think like it all starts with education, both formal and informal education too, right? There's obviously so much that needs to be done within the both public and private school systems in terms of teaching about issues and teaching from all these different viewpoints. There's also so much that to be said for learning from community organizations and different clubs and learning from each other too, because a lot of times it I feel bad for teachers a lot of times because a lot of times it's being filtered through multiple layers, through the textbook authors and through whatever, and learning from activists and teachers and gardeners, for example, who are actually on the ground working is super valuable too.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think the role of adults is to give that guidance to kids because obviously students have the passion and the mobilization, like they're ready for it, but sometimes you need to understand the correct venues to go through to affect that change. So, do you have any advice for adults on like giving that guidance to students based on your own environmental leadership experiences?
Um, there are so many different things. One thing that just comes to mind right away is that it's like a dialogue that you need to listen both ways. And one thing that I've seen a lot is, especially a lot of adults think that the best way to connect with youth is through like electronic means, which obviously right now is one of the only ways to connect. But I would say that actually most youth who are interested in environmental work are would prefer like a hands-on way of engaging rather than like a new app or something like that. And I think that's just a little side note that I think is kind of an interesting thing that I've seen, is that a lot of people across the generational gaps feel that more electronic communication is the way to go, where I think that probably the opposite is actually true.
Yeah, I think hands on experience helps you form a more personal connection with the issue.
And I think that that ties into the education too. Like people, that's something that I've tried with programs in my high school, because we, like a lot of other schools, we have a community service requirement to graduate. And a lot of those, pretty much any opportunity that's offered is off campus and not during school hours. So if, especially for students who work or who don't drive, it's really hard to get to those
Mm-hmm.
opportunities. So that's part of why we started the gardens on campus, is to try to make a place on campus where people can engage
Mm-hmm.
and learn without it running into their outside time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that note on accessibility really hits on another issue that I wanted to talk about with you, which is transitioning to a sustainable society means being inclusive of those communities that are going to be hardest impacted by climate change. And we're talking low income folks, people of color, people that might not have accessibility to this knowledge or these resources to make change. So, what are your thoughts on how to create a more equitable and inclusive environmental movement?
I think, well, I think a lot of that ties into education again. Like if you start in elementary school or high school, middle school, whatever, early on with teaching about the the challenges and the interconnectedness, like we talked about before, like that's something that comes up a lot, is people, a lot of, I've seen a lot of people who are like, well, should we balance environmental justice more or social justice more? But I don't, they're not really that separate,
Mm-hmm.
like you talked about. Like the people who are most impacted by climate change and by any number of other environmental issues are going to be BIPOC and people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's definitely about meeting people where they're at. Cool. Well, that hits on the last question that I had for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Not particularly. I just, again, like the power of building community is something that I think a lot of people underestimate, because in activism, we're really quick to, we want to solve issues as quick as we can, but you really need to lay this groundwork before you can make any meaningful and long lasting change.